So we've been in this series called Kaleo, which is a proclamation of what the gospel is, sort of gospel 101, and I just want to give a brief recap. If you want broader sermons, you can just go back on our YouTube channel and look through the sermons. But right now, just a brief recap. First of all, the gospel is a calling on our lives, not a specific profession, right? But it's to you personally. So it's not that you and I are called to be pastors or nurses or teachers only, but anything and everywhere that you find yourself, you are actually called by God because the gospel is a calling on your life. The second thing that we know, and remember, all these sermons are like tied together, right? They come together like building blocks. The second one is that the gospel is a proclamation of a new reality, a relational reality where we are free from sin, and Jesus is our liberator of that. And we saw that in the story of Genesis and how the Exodus story translates to our own story. And so it is a creation. That's what the gospel is. It is the good news of a relational reality that has been created in Jesus. And in this reality, we are free from sin, right? Because Jesus is our liberator. And how do we know this? Well, his name was Jesus. And why was his name Jesus? Because he shall free his people from there. And then in Revelation 1:5, when he is introduced to John and the angel introduces him, he says, to Jesus, the one who loved us and freed us from our sins, right? So we are already looking at something that is done. That leads us then to the next reality, that sin and righteousness are not quantifiable realities. They're not something that you can't behave yourself into salvation, right? You can't behave yourself into salvation because righteousness and sin are not quantifiable things. You can't measure it out because the Christian life, the Christian walk, is not a calling for you and I to live in a bookkeeping fashion of what we do good or bad. It can't be bookkeeping. Well, I did X amount of bad things today, bad behaviors, so I need to balance it out with X amount of good behaviors. That's not how it works. Sin is a lot deeper than that. Right, we've been seeing that. This is probably like, we spent like 2 Saturdays talking about how sin is a lot deeper than just your bad behavior. Your bad behavior is the fruit of what is at the root. And what is at the root, and to be very clear, we all start out as sinners. Romans 3:23, all have sinned. Yep, nobody's discussing that. Nobody's arguing that. Nobody's debating that. We all start out that way. But sin is much more than just the committed bad behaviors. It is a standing. It is a condition we're born into, and you can't behave yourself out of it. Just like you can't behave yourself into salvation, you can't behave yourself out of sin, right? Because it's a condition that you and I are born into and that we have. And so the practical results of sin are shame, guilt, condemnation, alienation, death, and this inherited bent towards evil. Right? We've talked about this inherited bent towards evil that is easy to see if you live with small humans, right? Doesn't matter how small the human is, nobody taught the small human to lie, nobody taught the small human to run away. It's just in you. Why? Because that's the condition of sin, right? And it's based on lies, mainly the lie that says that you are not worthy, right? That you need to prove you are something by doing something, right? The lie says that you are not what God has called you to be, right? You are something else. Remember, we saw that last week when we looked at how Genesis 3, they were in the image of God, and the lie was, are you sure? No, you can be made like God. So the lie is always aimed at you proving, doubting what you have been called by God. Are we clear so far? Right? So let's go into the truth, because identity is really what we're talking about, right? We're talking about identity today, and I'd like to share a story that is very personal for me today, but let's talk about identity. See, because there's these things that one of the most vital questions that we will answer for ourselves in our life and our existence is the idea and is the question of who we are. And it really is how we carry out our existence. Who we are is foundational to our existence. Who am I? What am I? All those questions are the questions of identity, right? And it's very important. Experts see that, and there's 2 ways, essentially, that you can come up, and this is obviously a very summarized, a very simplified, perhaps oversimplified way of looking at identity, so bear with me on this one. But there's 2 ways. There's a non-Western way, which stems the identity comes from community. In other words, non-Western, non-American ways, right? It's the community that bestows the identity when you are fulfilling certain roles, right? If you're fulfilling a certain role, there's an expectation of that role that you're supposed to fulfill, and that gives you worth, so that's where your identity comes from. In the West, we're a little bit contrary to that. Modern Western society is diametrically opposed to that because you gain your identity by stripping away all ties from your community and from your family, and you look inward as opposed to outward to find your true self. It's also tied to worth, right? It's the cultural message of our day. Tim Keller, in The Meaning... Reason for God, Making Sense of God, Tim Keller, phenomenal Christian thinker and pastor, says that this is the cry of our age. It says, don't try to get affirmation from others. Affirm yourself because you are doing what you want to do. Be what you want to be, and it doesn't matter what everyone else thinks. Right? That's really in us. It's the way we conquered the West. On horseback and with a Winchester. Nobody determining our destiny but ourselves. I am the master of my domain. The great philosopher Elsa of Arundel actually quotes this, when she says, no right, no wrong, no rules for me. I'm free. Let it go. Right? And then she goes up to this mountain, right? She goes into this mountain by herself. She looks inward and she discovers who she really is, right? But that's the call of our age. That's really what we are. And the thing is, these two approaches of finding identity have shadow sides into them because there is this aspect of the destiny that comes from your community. If your community is the one that is imposing your identity based on a role that you will fulfill or not fulfill, then that's why the son of the carpenter has to become the son of the carpenter has to become a carpenter. You can't be a doctor. Why? Because it's sort of your destiny. It's the reason why girls, they stay home and they become moms. Right? That's the shadow side of that aspect of finding your identity. And it's the reason why America is this beacon of hope. Because here, the sons of carpenters can become doctors. Here in America, we can be whatever we want. Because we free ourselves from those constraints of how we have these expectations placed upon us from our community. So we can be whatever we want. But the shadow side of the West is that you bestow the verdict of significance on yourself. In other words, you do you, man. And there's a great example that I experienced when I was a teenager. Because as a teenager, I wanted to be like Mike. Teenagers of my age in the 90s, some of you younger ones are like, who's Mike? Greatest basketball player of all time. Not LeBron, no, Michael Jordan. End of discussion. 6-0 in the finals. Don't want to hear it. I wanted to be like Mike, right? And I figured that I couldn't be like Mike. First of all, because in Peru, where I was a frustrated soccer player that turned me into a basketball player, I was taller than my peers, so they made me play power forward or center. I know, super strange. I'm only 6'1", but I'm a giant in my country. So I ended up playing not the position of Michael Jordan. I didn't have the talent of Michael Jordan nor the moves of Michael Jordan. So I said, I will adopt a different identity to identify myself on the basketball court. So I said, I will be Shawn Kemp. Right? Makes sense. Bigger guy, taller, not as graceful as Michael, right? Big guy, ironically from the Sonics. And so I said, I'm going to be Shawn Kemp. And in high school, I even wore number 40 on my jersey. I'm going to be Shawn Kemp. But here's the thing about me telling myself, going back to this idea of Tim Keller that you bestow the verdict of significance on yourself, is that no matter how many times I told myself that I was Shawn Kemp, no matter how many videos of Shawn Kemp I watched, no matter how many times I wore number 40 on my jersey, what was the reality? Is that I was not Shawn Kemp by a mile. I was just a very short Peruvian version looking of a kid that wanted to be Shawn Kemp. And if I would tell myself and bestow upon myself the verdict that I'm Shawn Kemp, you would call me crazy, right? Why? Because reality does not reflect the fact that I say that I'm Shawn Kemp. The shadow side of finding your identity within yourself. Tim Keller once again. And this is really a long quote, but it's really important for us to get before we jump into the biblical text this morning, because he says, we need someone from the outside to say that we are of great worth. And the greater the worth of that someone or someone's, the more power they have to instill a sense of self and worth. He continues, only if we are approved and loved by someone whom we esteem can we achieve any self-esteem. To use biblical terms, we need someone to bless us because we can't bless ourselves. We are irreducibly social and relational beings. We need someone we respect to respect us. We need someone we admire to admire us. And he finishes by saying, even when modern people claim to be validating themselves, the reality is always that they are socializing themselves into a new community of peers, of cheerleaders, of people whose approval they crave. The profoundness and the depth of Tim Keller's statement cannot be dismissed, my friends. There's so many implications of what he's saying. Implications for us as parents. How we speak to our children. How we speak to our children, parents. It is vital to understand that if they don't understand from us, their parents, whom they admire by nature and they look up to by nature, if they don't see that from us, it's not going to go well. And you educators nodding your heads with me right now, you get it, right? Yeah. So let's go into the text this morning. Understanding that, especially this part, that the greater the worth of somebody bestowing the identity on you, the greater you will feel. Keep that in mind as we go into this story. Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15, 11 through 37. We've known this story. We've heard it a million times. So we're going to go really, really quick in it. It's a story about two sons. One is good, one is bad, right? One goes away and one leaves. And that's where the story. We're going to pick up the story. We're going to pick up the narrative in verse 17. Luke 15, 17, that's where we're going to pick it up, where it says, and he came to his senses. When things went bad, this boy says, and he came to his self, says, or when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father. I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Now, this story has a whole lot of context that we're not going to necessarily get into today, but we're going to start right here. And a lot of times we read this text and we say, well, he got sorry. I would like to humbly submit to you this morning that he is not necessarily sorry nor repentant. He is hungry. He is in need. And need is the mother of all necessity, right? And the mother of ingenuity. That's what this boy is hungry, he's going to do something about it. Why do you say that, preacher? Isn't he saying that I have sinned against heaven? And he goes, this is why, right? Yes, he has a speech. The speech says, I have done this bad thing. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. So he's acknowledging that he's done something wrong, because obviously telling your father, hey, give him my inheritance or basically drop dead, then going away and living la vida loca and squandering all of it in bad living when COVID hits, and then you're hungry, clearly is something bad, and you need to acknowledge that you've done something bad. And this, being a good Jewish boy, is saying, I've done really something bad, and I need to make restitution for the bad thing that I've done. So he's going to acknowledge and say, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired workers. And this is where I say that he's come up with a plan, not necessarily sorry. Because he could have said, I will be a slave, I will be a house slave, but he says specifically, I'm going to be a day worker, mistheos. Why is this significant? Simple. This is what a day worker would do in the ancient Near East. This is what a day worker would do in the time of Jesus. They were hired for a specific role, right? They maintain their independence. They receive a salary. They don't live in the house of the master. And he has his own residence. He gets fed by the one who is hiring him. So this boy is coming back home saying, I will be a day worker. Not a slave, not a house slave. Because who wants to be a slave? Nobody. House slaves or house workers were the ones that lived in the house and they didn't have any independence. But the day worker is receiving a salary. I can receive a salary. I can live off my father's expense. I can save some money and then hope to pay off the debt that I have incurred with my father. I get fed by my father. I don't touch my older brother's inheritance. And so I have now accounted for the two parties that have been offended, my father and my brother. I'll have to deal with the community another way. Are you following what he's doing? He's no dummy. This young man is smart. He's quite intelligent. That's why he's come up with this plan in which he's going to repay his father through the salary which he gets every day, the money that he lost. Except, can you really repay what you've lost? Because that's a whole lot of money, my man. But he's got a plan. Boy's got a plan, and he's going to follow it. He can live off the expense of the father, receive a salary, make restitution, not touch his brother's inheritance. So the story says that he comes home. Now let me tell you something. When this boy is coming home, he's coming home with shame, right? And guilt and condemnation. You follow? You follow the story? Yeah? Yeah? Shame, guilt, condemnation. What's even more is he's coming back home with this text of Deuteronomy 21:18 through 21 in his mind. Do you know what Deuteronomy 18 through 21 says? Deuteronomy 21:18 through 21, you can look it up. I'm not going to read it, but it basically says that if a parent has a child who is rebellious and a drunkard, he can take him, he will take him to the elders of the city, and the elders of the city will stone him to death. Talk about misbehaved kids and how you deal with them, huh? How convenient is that? Because you will purge Israel from that evil. Now listen, I personally would not do that with any of my kids, but it's in the Bible. So this boy is coming home thinking what? That's right. What he deserves is a stoning. He deserves a beating. And the audience that is listening to Jesus is probably thinking the same thing, especially when in the first part he says, give me my inheritance. Well, they're thinking, this boy deserves a slap in the face at least. Oh no, but the father gave him the inheritance. And the story just keeps on unearthing and turning on its heads all the social expectations that the people should have about what's happening with this boy. Because leaving home and coming back as a failure is embarrassing enough. I remember when I unwittingly immigrated to the United States of America in the year 2003. By month 2, I wanted to go back home because I was severely depressed. I left my family, my friends, everybody. I'd left this girl that I fell in love with madly. I married her eventually, just in case y'all are wondering, did he have another girlfriend? Yes, I did, but that's not the one that I wanted to go back for. This was the one that gave me 2 daughters later. But I was severely depressed and sad and moped. You know why I didn't go back? Shame. Do you know how embarrassing it would be for me to go back home? Because I failed. So the only thing that kept me here, aside from the fact that I was making, I had a job, was the fact that, and I didn't have enough to buy a plane ticket to go back home, was the sheer embarrassment of going back home. So this boy is going back home because remember, it's a small village, small community. He's going back home. Everybody knows how he left, and everybody knows that when he's walking through the city gates, everybody is knowing, oh, this boy, look at him. Look at this good-for-nothing boy coming back home. He looked terrible. So we're going to receive him like he's due. We're just going to, right? We're going to do the thing. And as he is coming home in failure and in shame, you can hear, you see the narrative, and it says, and the father saw him while he was long away, before he enters the gates. The father is what does the text says? He was moved to? Runs, kisses, and embraces the child. Here's the thing. The boy is coming home. That's the city gate. He's coming home with shame. And all of a sudden, from inside the city, from inside the village, whatever it is, you hear, as the people are looking at that boy coming through the entry, through the door, you hear the steps in the dust and the sandals and the panting of a man running to get his boy. And you and I do not understand the significance of the shame that it calls in the ancient Near East for a wealthy man of distinguished category to run. But when a man of wealth and of age run, that is a no-no. It is shameful. So notice what the father is doing. The father is taking the shame that belongs to that boy, and he is putting it upon himself by running to encounter this boy, and instead of giving him up to the elders to be stoned, he embraces this boy first. He kisses him. And then he says, welcome back. He puts a ring, a robe, a ring, and sandals on him. He makes a declaration of his identity. He says, this son was, and he was dead. Yeah, he was lost, he was found, he was dead, and now he is alive. Let us celebrate. Are you picking up what I'm laying down? Are you smelling what I'm cooking? He takes the shame that belongs to the guilty party and he bears it upon himself. Because that's the type of father we have. And he declares upon this boy the identity he never lost. This is the tricky part for all of us. Because a lot of us like to look at the story of the prodigal son and we forget that he was always what? Always son. Lost? Yes. Dead? Absolutely. But what was his identity? Son. Now imagine that this boy, and remember, if you notice the narrative, the boy says, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And that's where it stops. What part of the speech is missing? Let me be like one of your workers. So imagine this, that while they're in the celebration, right? While they're in the celebration, that the son says, hey, Dad, hey, thanks for receiving me, man. Can I work for you? Is that weird? Middle of a party, fatted calf, music, dancing. I'm home. Hey, thanks for, I'm overwhelmed, man. You mind if I work for you? Because I really don't deserve to. Is that weird? Isn't it weird to be calling yourself something that you're not? Isn't it weird to continually putting yourself down when you've already been lifted up? But this is where the story gets personal for me. That's me in 2014, first day at the College U Church job. In the year of our Lord of 2019, I was going through a dark period of time in my life. And I was a college pastor, like some of you know. I was pastoring the largest church in the Mid-America Union, 2,100 members, 7 pastors on staff. I had arrived. But in the darkness, a friend of mine suggested that I should go on a personal spiritual retreat. All the good ones, all the big ones do it, Harold. You should do it. And I said, well, yeah, all the big ones do it, so should I. Because I'm a big one. Of course, I wouldn't tell you that because I was humble, you see. I was humble. So in the middle of Nebraska, I found a retreat center. Well, my friend, she found me the retreat center in the middle of Nebraska. And I went. September 13, I got there. I drove out to said retreat. And the reason why I went was, one, is because the big ones do it, and two, at the time that I was going through this dark period of my life, a friend of mine was preaching some stuff, a new take on the gospel, and I thought he was wrong. And since I thought he was wrong, and I needed to prove he was wrong, I went to this retreat to find fault with his theology. I was going to prove him wrong, because that's what I do. I stand with the truth, right? I stand with the truth. I'm going to use truth as a weapon because, see, you haven't known that about me. So there I was in this weekend in a small town in the middle of Nebraska, and the Spirit leads me to this exact story. It's fascinating as I look back through my stories, finding this picture yesterday through my archive of pictures. I have these screenshots of the whiteboard in the room where I was, arriving to conclusions that I had forgotten that I had arrived. And the Spirit leads me to the story, and I read the story, and I audibly say, this story doesn't do anything for me. It's nonsense. And I audibly immediately hear back, keep reading. So I did. You see, the younger son had a scheming to pay problem. He was positioning himself where he didn't belong. The older son sees himself in a way that doesn't belong to him. Both sons in this story, my friends, have a problem with seeing themselves as what they are not. And they are bent on giving themselves identities that do not correspond to them. They are bent on echoing the lies about themselves, both seeing themselves less than how their father sees them. One is entitled, the other is bitter. Both are lost. And so there I was on September 14, 2019. I was reading this, and I hear this voice that immediately responds to like this, doesn't make sense. This story does nothing. It is nonsense. Keep reading. And so I read, and the older son comes back from the field. And he asks, what is the noise? What is this noise going on? Oh, hey, your brother is back. Isn't that crazy? And your father has killed a fatted calf. He was throwing a party for him. It's amazing. And the older brother, instead of saying, oh, how cool, my little brother is back, he stands outside and he throws an absolute fit. And here's the thing, my friends. Identity drives so much of our existence that we'll find ourselves acting out in ways we didn't even suspect, solely based on what we think ourselves of and others. Are you following this? The way you view yourself and the way you view others will determine how you act towards others. It is why knowing your identity is so vital. And so here is this son. Like I said, both of them are lost in the house. One is entitled and one is bitter. And here's the older son outside of the party, enraged and throwing the biggest tantrum you could imagine. He's abandoning his duty of the older son. The duty of the older son is this. Culturally, once again, if there is a feast, if there is a party, the host is obviously the father of the house. The oldest son is a co-host, and the co-host is called to make sure that the person of honor, are you following this? The person of honor, the guest of honor, is well attended. Who is the guest of honor in this party? The little brother. What is the older brother's duty? Make sure that his little brother is well attended. Cup served, food always filled. Are you comfortable, little brother? That's what he's supposed to be doing. But instead, he is reneging his duty. He's standing outside and he becomes angry. 8 times in the New Testament, this word angry is used, and all of them is negative. Man is boiling over. And rather than receiving what he deserves, just like with the first son, the father comes out to meet his oldest son. Are you following the story? Are you with me, church? And he begins to entreat him. The word is para Kaleo. Encourage, comfort, console, ask earnestly. Instead of punishment, instead of going outside and slapping this boy across the face because he should be inside. Now, shouldn't he? He knows his duty. And you know that party is going on inside, and here comes the father, leaves the house, and you know the music is going on, and then, it stops, like every time the music stops, like, that creak of the violins. Because everybody's looking at the host. Go outside. They see the father and the son standing. And they see the father entreating his son, his older boy, comforting, encouraging, consoling, asking earnestly to come back inside. If one was bringing shame in his departure, the other is doing with his attitude. He hasn't forgotten his role. He just doesn't want to do it. And once again, rather than giving what is due, the father comes out and encourages him. And so the reaction of the father is so different. It's in absolute contrast to the reaction of the son, the oldest son. It is taking the shame and not living in it. Oh, church, come on now. Taking the shame, not living in it. The oldest son replies, all these years I have slaved for you. It's the problem of the older son. He sees himself as a slave, as a servant, as an employee. He sees his father as an exacting master because he says, I've never disobeyed your command. The identity he lives in is that of a bitter worker that deserves more than what he thinks he has. The problem with those of us, older brothers who never left the house, you follow, you picking up what I'm saying, church, who never left the house, those of us who don't have the amazing testimony, is that we don't really understand that our identity is that of sons, of daughters, of children. When you are an employee and a slave, you're actually always weary in watching your performance review. You are looking at your performance so that your boss can promote you and keep you around, because it's performance reviews that are central. And thus you keep a good show, a good facade, a manicured lawn, the proper demeanor, the proper and competent professionalism, because that is only thing that will keep you along. But that only goes so far, because at some point when somebody gets something that you think that they do not deserve, the professionalism cracks. And the crack ensures, it shows in your marriage, in your family, at work, and at church, because you start to lash out because you think that you're not getting promoted, and you think that you're not getting the things that are due to you. You've sacrificed to get. You've abstained yourself from the bad things to get good things. You've not done the bad behaviors. So why is God not promising what he said he was going to do? Why is he not doing what he said he was going to do? Why is my marriage bad? Even look, all the good things that I did. Why is my work so crummy when I keep all my tithe? Why is all this when I do all the good things? Why is my health failing when I don't eat meat? Why? Why? Because you think you're a worker. You forgot you're a son. And you see everybody else as a co-worker at best and a subordinate normally. So that means that you got to keep tabs on them. You got to make sure that they do the right thing. So when people don't perform, they deserve to be what? Fired. So you measure them according to some standard that you have and that you think that you should be fair. And when it's not fair, you accuse this son of yours. You can hear that it's not this son of yours, but there's a whole lot of epithet going on in there. When this son of yours comes back, who's wasted all the money in prostitutes and drunken living, you throw a party for this guy? Man, you one lousy boss. That's what he's saying. I don't even get a lousy goat from you. The contrast of goat meat and fatted calf, I mean, the cult, right? Why? Because he thinks that he is an employee. And here's the thing about slaves and employees, they can never be owners of the business, right? A slave or an employee, just a good employee, no matter how good the CEO is, he's never going to be the owner of Amazon, right? You follow? Yeah? Imagine that Jeff Bezos has a kid. You know who's going to be the owner of Amazon when Jeff Bezos dies? His kid. Not the CEO. Right? Sam Walton left Walmart to who? His CEOs? No, his kids. The problem of you and I considering ourselves as workers is that we will never be able to own the business. And no matter how hard we climb that ladder, we will never be able to own it. And so the only way to own it is to remove the owner from ownership forcibly. And there is only one being in the biblical narrative that said, I will be like God. Because he needs to remove the owner, because he never saw himself as anything more than a slave or a worker. And that's where I found myself. How does a father respond? My son. He says, my son. He uses an endearment term. He doesn't use a technical term, huios. He uses the word teknon. Teknon is endearment. In Spanish, it would be mijo, mija. If you know the Hispanic, mijo, right? Mijo, mija. My son, my child. You've always been with me. all I have is yours. And as I was reading that, it broke me. So there I was in this room in the middle of Nebraska. And I read these words, and they broke me. Because my friends, for 30 years, from 0 to 10, I don't count my life because I was a kid, what do I know? But for 30 years, from 10 to 40, I had seen God as my boss and myself as his worker. Oh, I was a good worker. Yeah, I was. Proof of it was the fact that in 2003, I landed in New Mexico with 2 suitcases and I planted a church with 25 people. And 11 years later, with no connections, here I was at the largest church of that same union with 2,100 church members and 7 pastors under my care. I am a good worker. Yes, it's all by God's grace, but clearly I am a good worker. Especially if I'm being promoted every 2 years, right? I am climbing up that ladder at a speed that is neck-breaking. And oh yes, I'm super humble about it. But God was my boss, and I was his employee. And when promotions stopped coming, I would lash out. I would yearn for the affection. I would yearn for the need of people approving of me. And I would lash out in very unhealthy behaviors that only my boss and I would know about. And I would fear to be discovered because I would deserve the punishment of falling from the highest of pedestals. And so I served him out of fear and out of shame of being found. And as I'm reading the text that night, that afternoon, on September 14 of 2019, and he says, "My son, you've always been with me. All I have is yours." The facade of the employee cracked. And I wrote down stuff on a whiteboard, and I took a picture of it, and I went to bed thinking, could it be that all my life, that my entire professional career, I have been seeing God in a lens that I should not be seeing him? And yes, it was. So the next morning, I had breakfast. I walked up that path that you're seeing in that picture, and I got to that cross that you're seeing in that picture that is in a graveyard that I probably shouldn't have been in because there was a gate, but it was open, and I just walked in. And I went and I knelt at the foot of that silver metal cross. And I died. I died on September 15 of 2019. And I was reborn. I didn't tell anybody that I died that day. I just went home. I said I was going to be there for 4 days, but I needed only 3. I had seen what I needed to see. I discovered what I needed to discover. And it's the only thing you hear me talk about now. I went home. My poor wife, she didn't know what happened. She just knew that this guy is different. He's not the same guy. And week 1 went by because, husbands will behave well, right? After we've done something stupid, right? No, we don't use that word. Sorry. We've done something foolish. We'll behave ourselves well for a week, right, to get out of the doghouse. Maybe we're successful and we'll behave by 2. But then when week 3 and 4 go by, you're like, who is this guy, right? When you're not saying anything and people come up to you and say, what have you done? You're not preaching, oh, hey, I've changed. Well, who needs to say that? You just live your life differently, and people begin to notice something about you, about your smile, about your demeanor. It doesn't mean that you don't make mistakes or you don't fall. It just means that there's something different about your life, and it shows. And I can tell you that I didn't proclaim it. I didn't say it. People started telling me. And you have no basis to know that because you didn't know that guy. Thank God you didn't know that guy. You wouldn't want him as your pastor. He sucked. He wouldn't listen to you. You would come with weird ideas, he'd dismiss you immediately, calling you a moron. With my face and with my eyes. I'd use the truth to demean you. You didn't know that guy. But that guy died because he heard the father telling him, what? My son, you've always been with me. All I have is yours. Because here's the thing, my friends. The father never wanted monetary restitution because the father has unlimited resources. The father wants relational restoration, so he makes it happen. Here's the thing. If I tell you the sky is pink right now, what would you qualify me as? Crazy, charlatan maybe, right? We'd have to go outside and see the sky is pink. No, it's not. If I tell you, hey, it's raining, what would we do? Well, we're going to go to the door. No, I'm not going to bring a bin this time. Don't worry. Relax. Nope, not raining. It's not raining today. But if God says immediately, if he would manifest himself here and he would say the sky is pink, what would happen? Sky is pink. If God would manifest himself here and say it's raining, what would happen? Because what he speaks, he creates. What he says is reality, right? So here's the deal. That is in Christ. God was what? The world too? Read that. Woo, Lord. Come on now, church. What did he do? Did you read Colossians like I told you to read? First chapter of Colossians. Remember I told you last week, read Colossians, first chapter. So if he has said something about you, why you keep putting yourself down? John chapter 8, and we're going to finish with this. John chapter 8 talks about this whole idea of like the truth shall set you free. And I love how I used to use this verse, and the truth, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. I used to use this verse as an apologetics verse, right? I would use it in Bible study, and I would be like, the truth shall set you free. The truth of the Sabbath, the truth of the state of the dead, the truth of the second coming, it shall set you free. But I really wasn't free. Why? This text is not talking about apologetics, my friends. This text is talking about freedom from sin. John chapter 8, verses 32 to 36 is the message of Jesus Christ telling you you are free from sin. You don't believe me? Read there with me. Come on, John. Quick. John chapter 8. Pastor John read it this morning. John read John. Ha 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 ha. Right? John chapter 8, verse 31. If you abide in my word, you're my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. They answered him, we are Abraham's children. We've never been in bondage to anyone. Hello, Romans, but sure, knock yourself out. How can you say you will be made free? And Jesus answered, most assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin. And a slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed. What's he freeing you from? And if he spoke it, he came to his own, but his own did not recognize him. Let me go back on that one. He came to his own, but his own did not recognize him. But to those who believe, to those who receive and believe, to them he gave the authority to be called what? So what are you? The truth is, my friends, your identity is vital. The lie has always been to doubt your identity and to prove through whatever efforts you want to make the identity that has been spoken over you. But the truth of your identity is that you are so live accordingly. Live as a child. Live from the abundance of the grace that God has given you. Live from the new heart that He has placed in your life, where you can actually live loving others in a very non-strings attached way, where you don't have to live craving the approval and the acceptance of everybody. You don't have to be using truth as a weapon. You actually get to live with no strings attached. So you don't need approval from your spouse. You don't need approval from your peers. You don't need approval from your boss. You don't need approval from your pastor. You don't need anything, because all I have is yours. That is good news.